You are listening to Book Clips, a podcast where authors and narrators expose you to excerpts from different books. You can find the show and more by searching for The Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher.
Hi, I'm Cara Malone, and today I'll be doing a reading from the first chapter of my novel, Love in the Stacks. Shell Tate sat in one of the well-worn chairs that lined the lobby of the Westbrook Public Library, clutching her resume and waiting for a job interview. It was mid-morning on a weekday, so there were not many people in the library. Just her and a slightly mean-looking man at the reference desk. It certainly would not be the most glamorous job in the world if she got it, nor the most suited to the degree she'd just earned. It was only a page position, a part-time job putting books back on the shelves, and it really didn't require anything more than a basic competency with the Dewey Decimal System. A high school kid could do it. But here she was, dressed in a black blazer while the August sun beat down through the skylights, waiting for the library director and trying not to look too desperate. Shell needed this job, the only one in Westbrook that she was even remotely qualified for, because her parents had been threatening to cut her off ever since she declared her useless major. Their words, not hers. Now that she'd graduated, the job search was getting dire, and she had to see the point that there weren't a lot of places clamoring for exercise scientists. I don't know why you couldn't have gone into accounting like me. I make good money and work decent hours, and there will always be a need for accountants. Shell could hear her mother's objections running through the back of her mind like a nagging playlist. And, of course, there were her father's more blunt criticisms. Why do you need a degree to be a personal trainer? Michelle, I never did understand where your head was. The general consensus around the Tate household had always been that Shell was a bit of a screw-up. So while being a library page wasn't exactly Shell's dream job, she hoped that it was enough of a step in the right direction, responsible, adult, bill-paying, that her parents would acknowledge the effort and back off a little so she could figure out her next move. The reference librarian looked over at her and narrowed his eyes, sizing her up, Shell thought. So she straightened her blazer and ran a hand over her long red hair to tame any flyaways that the summer heat caused on the drive over here. She was determined not to mess this up. A door opened just behind the reference desk, and Shell straightened up. Michelle Tate? The girl who called her name was petite, dressed in a very conservative black pantsuit and pointed heels, with her chestnut hair done up in the stereotypical librarian bun, and the wispy strands of her bangs were the only thing about her appearance that didn't scream formal. These were the first things Shell noticed about her, but as soon as she stood up to greet her, she noticed what was actually the girl's most prominent feature. Her large eyes were a stunning, icy blue that drew Shell into them and awoke something wanton in her core. She had to make a conscious effort not to bite her lip or turn on the charm like she most definitely would have done if she'd been doing almost anything else except waiting on her job interview. The girl was gorgeous, and all the stuffy businesswoman suits in the world couldn't conceal the curve of her hips. A bit of a rake at heart, Shell tucked the thought into the back of her mind that perhaps this girl would still be around after her interview was over, as she said, "I'm Michelle." She went across the small lobby, past the reference desk where the librarian still hadn't found anything better to do than openly watch the exchange between them. Then the girl held out her hand and said, "I'm Mira Lockhart. I'm the director." Shell slid her hand into Mira's palm, trying to disguise her surprise. Mira was so young, she'd been expecting her to be the director's assistant. The handshake lasted only a couple of seconds. Mira's palm was soft and warm, and she gave Shell's hand a firm, almost aggressive shake. But it made Shell's heart rate jump a little. She had a long history of reading into handshakes, smiles, and the language of the eyes, and however brief it had been, there was something flirtatious about the way Mira's hand lingered in Shell's just an instant too long. "We'll go into my office for the interview," Mira said, then turned to the reference librarian and asked, "Holding down the fort okay, Jack?" "Have been long before you got here, my dear," he replied, with a somewhat tense smile that did a pretty half-hearted job of making his comment into a joke. "And we've only had one trash can fire this week," Mira shot back, completely unfazed by this apparent effort at insubordination. "Keep up the good work." Then she opened the door and gestured for Shell to follow. Once she was trailing Mira down a narrow hallway lined with offices, Shell felt free to smirk. She was liking Mira more and more with every passing minute. A woman who didn't take shit and managed to look damn fine even in a shapeless pantsuit. Shell let her eyes fall down from Mira's tight bun over her small frame to her cinched waist, and finally down her slender legs swimming in formless black fabric. Shell was trying to keep herself from imagining Mira in a stereotypical librarian's outfit. Skin-tight pencil skirt that hugged every curve, blouse billowing open just beyond decency, horn-rimmed glasses, and a pair of sheer stockings with a seam running up the back of her legs and disappearing under her skirt. Then Mira opened a door at the end of the hall. "Home sweet home," she said, stepping aside to let Shell enter. The office was on the smaller side, not cramped exactly, but not what one would expect for the director of an organization. Then again, Westbrook was not the most metropolitan of towns. The room was cozily decorated, and it was obvious that Mira spent a lot of time here. From the extra blazer hanging on the back of her door, to the mini fridge along one wall, to the small pile of well-worn books on the arm of a comfy-looking plush chair by the window. Shell went to one of the less inviting, straight-backed chairs in front of a large oak desk, while Mira closed the door and walked behind the desk. "So," Mira said, settling into her chair, "tell me about yourself, Michelle." "It's Shell," she corrected automatically, having adamantly resisted her full name for her entire life. Then she bit her lip, wondering if it was appropriate to ask this steely-eyed goddess to call her by her nickname. Sorry. I just always thought Michelle sounded so uptight." The space between her words and Mira's response seemed to stretch out for a beat too long, during which Shell wondered how bad a breach of interview etiquette she'd just made. But then Mira smiled. It lit her whole face up, erasing any lingering formality she'd worn in the lobby. Shell hadn't thought it was possible for her to be any more breathtaking, but clearly she'd been wrong. "My name is Miranda, so trust me, Shell, I understand," she said with a slightly self-conscious laugh, and the craving stirring in Shell's core made itself known again as her name passed over Mira's delicate lips. "Oof," Shell answered with a playful wince, even as the logical part of her mind was screaming at her to take this interview seriously. The more primal parts of her couldn't help turning on the charm. "You're right. Mira suits you much better. It's soft and beautiful, like you." Mira paused, looking away as a faint blush formed on her porcelain cheeks. Shell was thoroughly enjoying the front row seat she had to watch Mira's reactions. It was pretty obvious that she wore her heart on her sleeve, and by the flush of her cheeks, she probably wasn't much good at poker. Shell could see the effect she was having from halfway across the room, and she wondered how much closer Mira would allow her to get. But Mira cleared her throat and composed herself, sitting a little straighter in her chair and looking Shell sternly in the eyes as she said, "You never answered my question." "You're right," Shell said, smiling back at her. "I'm a new graduate. I majored in exercise science, which my parents thought was a dumb idea, and which I'm starting to agree with them on, since no one in Westbrook, except for my exercise science professors, has ever heard of that term. I spent the last 4 years in the circulation department of the university library as a work-study student. I'm a runner, I like long walks on the beach, and I forgot to give you my resume when we sat down." As a job interview, this was one of the worst ones Shell had ever been on. There was something about Mira that just made her want to sweep everything off the desk between them and lay her down on it, regardless of what it meant for her bank account, her parents' support, or even her reputation in their small community as an unprofessional person who doesn't know how to act in an interview. As a study in flirtation, however, it was a masterclass. She'd only been in Mira's presence for about 10 minutes but she couldn't imagine making it through the rest of the hour giving straight answers and ignoring the heat building between them. Shell looked down at the neatly printed resume that she'd all but forgotten in her hands, and she decided to go for it. You've been listening to me, Cara Malone, doing a reading from my novel, Love in the Stacks. Thanks for listening.
This was an episode of Book Clips. Check out the show notes for more on this book. And it would be great if you would rate the show and subscribe to the Lesbian Talk Show podcast channel for more woman-centered content. If you are an author of lesbian fiction, then send us your reading. You can find out how on thelesbiantalkshow.com/reading.